I have been covering transatlantic security for 14 years. I have watched NATO survive the Iraq War split, the Libya disagreements, the Trump first term, and the slow fracturing of European consensus on defense spending. I have seen this alliance absorb punishment that would have destroyed any other multilateral institution on Earth. But what I am watching right now is different. What I am watching right now is not an alliance absorbing punishment. It is an alliance quietly deciding whether it still believes in itself, and the answer coming back from several capitals is not the one Washington wants to hear. Let me say the central claim plainly, without qualification, before we go any further. Multiple NATO allies have refused to support American-led military operations connected to the Iran crisis and the Strait of Hormuz, and the Trump administration has responded not with diplomacy but with threats that go to the heart of America's commitment to European defense. That is not speculation. That is the documented state of the alliance right now. To understand how significant that is, you need to understand what NATO actually is, not the bumper sticker version, but the functional reality of how the alliance operates. NATO is built on a single foundational principle, collective defense. Article 5 of the Washington Treaty holds that an attack on one member is an attack on all. But here is what most commentary gets wrong about that principle. It has never been automatic. It has always been political. When Article 5 was first invoked after September 11, 2001, the Allies came together, but the specific military contributions each nation made and the theaters in which they fought were negotiated, argued over, and in several cases refused. France pulled its forces from NATO's integrated command structure for decades. Germany has maintained constitutional restrictions on offensive military operations since World War II. The alliance has always been a coalition of sovereign nations with different threat perceptions, different publics, and different red lines. What has kept it together is shared belief, the belief that American commitment to European security is real, durable, and unconditional. The moment that belief fractures, the architecture of the alliance begins to hollow out from the inside. Keep that in mind. We will come back to it. Donald Trump's relationship with NATO did not begin with his second term. His first presidency was defined in part by a sustained and public campaign of pressure against European allies over defense spending. He called NATO obsolete. He suggested the United States might not defend members who did not meet the 2% GDP spending threshold. He questioned the value of an alliance that, in his framing, allowed wealthy European nations to free ride on American military power. European governments were alarmed but ultimately reassured themselves that American institutional structures, the Pentagon, the State Department, the Senate would hold the line. Those reassurances are now significantly harder to maintain. Trump's return to the White House has been accompanied by a sharper edge to the rhetoric and, critically, a willingness to connect NATO commitments to specific policy disputes in real time. Defense spending was always the flashpoint, but the Iran conflict has introduced a new and more dangerous variable into the transatlantic relationship. Because it is not a question of how much Europeans are spending on defense, it is a question of whether they will fight where Washington tells them to fight. The immediate context is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman is one of the most strategically critical choke points on Earth. Roughly 20% of global oil passes through it. Iran has repeatedly threatened to close it in the event of military confrontation with the United States. And as tensions over Iran's nuclear program escalated in the current crisis, the question of who would participate in enforcing freedom of navigation in that strait became, suddenly, a test of alliance loyalty. Washington wanted partners. Washington expected partners. What it got, according to reporting from Reuters, was a series of refusals, not public, not dramatic, but firm. Several NATO allies signaled they would not participate in American-led Hormuz operations. The reasons varied by country, but the pattern was clear. European governments, watching their publics after years of Ukraine fatigue and economic strain, were not prepared to follow the United States into a military confrontation with Iran that they had not been consulted on, that they did not believe was strategically necessary, and that carried the very real risk of escalating into a wider regional war. That refusal did not stay quiet for long. Trump's public criticism of NATO over the Iran situation was, by any measure, extraordinary. The President of the United States, speaking about a military alliance that has been the cornerstone of Western security for 75 years, characterized it as failing America. The language was familiar from his first term, but the context was radically different. In the first term, the criticism was about burden sharing in the abstract. Now it was about a live operational crisis. Now it was about allies who, in Washington's view, were refusing to stand with America when it mattered. Reuters reported that Trump's criticism of NATO over the lack of support for the Iran response was explicit and targeted. This was not a general complaint about spending percentages. This was the leader of the alliance's most powerful member telling his partners publicly that they had failed a test for European governments. That statement landed like a grenade. The European fear is not abstract. It is precise and it is documented. What European governments dread is what analysts call entrapment, being pulled into a conflict they did not choose, at a time they did not select, with consequences that will fall disproportionately on their own territory, their own economies, and their own populations. The Iraq War created a rupture over exactly this dynamic. France and Germany refused to join the coalition. The relationship survived, but it was damaged for years. The Iran scenario is worse, because this time the dispute is happening while Russian forces are still deployed along NATO's eastern flank, because this time European governments are simultaneously trying to sustain support for Ukraine, manage energy security, and absorb the economic consequences of years of geopolitical instability. The idea of simultaneously managing a Middle East escalation, on American terms, without meaningful consultation, is not something the European public will accept, and European leaders know it. Washington's response to that political reality has not been empathy. It has been escalation. The Washington Post reported that American officials began raising the possibility of reducing troop deployments in Europe in connection with the tensions over Iran. Let that sit for a moment. The United States began linking its military presence on the European continent, a presence that exists specifically to deter Russian aggression, to European compliance with American policy in the Middle East. That is a form of coercion. It is conditioning the defense of Europe on European obedience to American strategic priorities in a theater that most Europeans consider outside the scope of NATO's core mission. This is the moment where the internal divisions inside the alliance stopped being manageable and became structural. What comes next in this story will change everything about how we understand the alliance for the next decade. Stay with me. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, according to Reuters, moved quickly to acknowledge the tension and attempt to contain it. Rutte is a skilled political operator. He ran the Netherlands for over a decade and understands coalition management better than almost anyone currently serving in European politics. But even Rutte's careful. Public language could not conceal the depth of the disagreement, acknowledging European concerns about Trump's pressure while simultaneously trying to maintain alliance cohesion is a near impossible diplomatic needle to thread, and the fact that he had to do it publicly at all tells you how serious the situation had become. Spain was, in the reporting, among the most explicit in its resistance. Spanish officials pushed back against allowing American bases on Spanish territory to be used for operations connected to the Iran situation. This is not a minor footnote. American military infrastructure in Spain is significant. Rota Naval Station, in particular, is one of the most strategically important American bases in Europe, and its role in any Middle Eastern contingency is substantial. A Spanish veto on operational use of that base is not symbolic. It is operational. It creates real military constraints on what Washington can do and how quickly it can do it. Germany and other member states moved toward a different posture, urging alliance unity, calling for consultation, insisting that NATO's coherence was in everyone's interest. But unity, when invoked as a principle without agreement on the underlying policy, is not a solution. It is a deferral, and deferred crises inside alliances do not resolve themselves, they compound. Here is where we have to be honest about what is established fact and what is reasonable inference, because this story is still developing and the line between analysis and speculation matters. What is documented? NATO allies refused involvement in Hormuz-related operations. Trump publicly criticized the alliance over that refusal. Rutte confirmed the pressure and acknowledged European resistance. The Washington Post reported true production threats connected to the broader tension over Iran. Spain resisted the use of its bases. These are not disputed claims. What is assessment rather than confirmed fact? NATO as a formal institution is strained, but it has not broken. There is no confirmed American withdrawal from the alliance. Article 5 remains technically intact. The disagreement is real and serious, but it has not yet produced a formal rupture at the treaty level. The distinction matters because people who want to dismiss this story will point to the absence of a formal break and say, nothing has changed, the alliance survives, this is just politics, and people who want to overstate the case will say the alliance is finished. Neither is accurate. The truth is harder and more dangerous than either of those positions. The truth is that an alliance can be functionally hollowed out long before it formally dissolves. The architecture can remain while the substance drains away. That is precisely what I am watching happen. So what comes next? Let me walk through the realistic trajectories, because the range of outcomes here is genuinely wide. The first possibility is managed compromise. NATO members, led by the Secretary General and the more institutionally minded European governments, attempt to construct a face-saving middle path, some form of limited participation in Hormuz-related activity that does not require direct combat operations, perhaps maritime monitoring, or logistics support that allows Washington to claim Allied solidarity while keeping European publics out of a shooting war. This has worked before. It is the kind of institutional creativity that kept NATO together through previous crises. It requires goodwill on all sides. Right now, goodwill is the scarcest resource in transatlantic politics. The second possibility is continued European distancing. If the Trump administration continues to frame the Iran situation in terms of alliance loyalty rather than shared strategic interest, European governments facing their own election cycles, their own publics, their own economic pressures will continue to find ways to say no. Without formally saying no, they will offer symbolic support, attend the meetings, issue the and quietly decline to commit forces to operations they do not believe in. The alliance will continue to exist on paper while its operational coherence degrades in practice. This is the slow-motion version of fracture, and it is arguably more dangerous than an open break because it is harder to diagnose and harder to reverse. The third possibility, and I want to be precise that this remains the least likely of the three, but it can no longer be excluded, is a genuine crisis of confidence that forces a public reckoning. If Washington makes good on true production threats, if European governments respond by accelerating autonomous European defense structures, if the disagreement over Iran escalates into a public and unresolvable confrontation, the alliance could face a moment where its contradictions can no longer be managed. That moment has not arrived, but the direction of travel is toward it, not away from it. The deeper issue, the one that keeps me up at night after 14 years of covering this, is not the Iran crisis specifically. Iran is the trigger, not the cause. The cause is a fundamental divergence in threat perception between the United States and its European allies, and a growing American political consensus on both left and right, but especially on the populist right, that alliances are transactions rather than commitments, that they should be maintained only insofar as they serve immediate American interests, and that European reluctance to follow American military leadership is a form of betrayal rather than a legitimate expression of sovereign judgment. That divergence did not begin with Trump. It was building for years before him. Trump is the most powerful expression of it, not its origin. And that means that even if Trump leaves the political stage, the underlying dynamic does not disappear. European governments know this. Their push towards strategic autonomy, their investment in European defense structures that do not depend on American political will, is not anti-American. It is a rational adaptation to a changed political environment, but Washington often reads it as exactly the kind of European freelancing that justifies reducing the American commitment, and that misreading feeds the very dynamic that European governments are trying to survive. Step back now and look at the full picture simultaneously, because it is only when you see all of it at once that the scale of the moment becomes clear. You have an active military conflict involving Iran and potential Hormuz closure threatening global energy markets. You have NATO allies publicly refusing American operational requests for the first time in a generation. You have the United States threatening to reduce the military presence in Europe that deters Russian aggression, while Russian forces remain deployed along NATO's eastern frontier. You have the Secretary General of the world's most powerful military alliance publicly trying to manage a rift between its leading member and its European core. You have Spain restricting American base access. You have Germany urging unity without agreement on the underlying policy. You have a transatlantic relationship that, depending on the next few decisions made in Washington and Brussels and Berlin and Madrid, could stabilize into a new and diminished normal, or could crack in ways that reshape the security architecture of the entire Northern Hemisphere. History tells us something important about how institutions fail. They rarely fail from outside. They fail from the inside, when the people who depend on them stop believing in them. The Soviet Union did not collapse because it was invaded. It collapsed because its own elite stopped believing the story they had been telling. The League of Nations did not die in a dramatic confrontation. It died when its members quietly stopped showing up and meaning it. Every great institutional failure in modern history has followed the same pattern. First the private doubts, then the public hedging, then the slow withdrawal of belief that makes the formal collapse, when it comes, feel like a foregone conclusion. I am not saying NATO is about to collapse. I am saying I am watching the private doubts. I am watching the public hedging. I am watching the withdrawal of belief, not complete, not irreversible, but real and accelerating in ways I have not seen before. If the allies who built this alliance together no longer trust that its most powerful member will honor its commitments, and if that most powerful member no longer trusts that its allies will follow its lead, then what exactly is NATO defending, and for whom? That is not a rhetorical question. It is the question that will define the next decade of global security, and the answer is being written right now, in real time, by decisions being made in capitals that are running out of room to hedge. If you are watching this and you understand the stakes, subscribe, because this story is not over. It has barely begun, and every development in the coming weeks will matter enormously to anyone who wants to understand where the world is actually going.